Welcome back to the Health 3.0 podcast, where the innovators of the future of healthcare share insights you need to take control of your health today. Today, I have a fantastic interview for you. I interview Cynthia Thurlow. Welcome to Health 3.0. I'm Dr. Doug Lucas, and I've spent my career working inside a healthcare system that too often waits until you're sick before it pays attention. We're moving past that. We're ready for a new system. We need Health 3.0. This show is for men and women in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who are starting to feel those midlife shifts, that fatigue that creeps in, the weight that's harder to manage. This show is for people who want to take control of their health now. So if you're ready to move past sick care, if you want to know what Health 3.0 looks like in your own life, you're in the right place. All right, welcome Cynthia Thurlow to Health 3.0. I am really glad that you're here.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Doug. I've been looking forward to it.
Man, so thank you so much for passing along the early edition copy of your book. That was really fun to read. So we will talk about how people can access this in the future at the end of our show today. But I wanted to start by basically me telling you that when it comes to perimenopause, there are a lot of people who are out there having conversations, but there are not a lot of influencers, providers, people in the space who I would consider an expert in the space. And I do consider you one of those people. So I just want to start by saying that.
Thank you.
But for our audience who maybe they don't know you or they know you for some of the work you've done in the past, give us a sense of why you think that you are the right person to be talking about this.
Yeah, thank you for that. I've been a nurse practitioner for 25 years and started my kind of background in cardiology and ER medicine. And 9 years ago, pivoted sharply and really jumped into women's health and perimenopause and menopause. And that's really where I've been over the last 9 years, kind of evolving with the times and staying ahead of trends and staying ahead of research and really establishing a podcast and a platform that is very evidence-based and very research-focused, but translating science into action. And that's really what I think is special and unique about my messaging is that I'm able to really distill down the science and make people aware of the things that they can do to improve the quality of their life, whether if that's lifestyle mediated, supplements, medications, and really over the last 9 years, getting really focused and very interested in the microbiome and the science there, as you and I both know, has really only come about in the last 5 to 10 years. It'll continue to evolve, but certainly wasn't part of my medical training, and I'm sure was not part of yours either.
No, not a lot of conversation about the microbiome and orthopedics, to be fair.
No.
But or in medical school at all at that time. So I loved your book, and again, it's called The Menopause Gut, and again, we'll talk about how people can get in line to get this book because I think that it is a unique look at perimenopause, and I read a lot of literature on the space. So we're not going to have time to talk about all the things in this book that are valuable, but I want to talk about probably the two biggest components. So perimenopause in general, the gut, the microbiome, and then I really want to get into actionable things that women can do if they're experiencing these things. What can they actually look at in their own life? Because so many of these things are readily available. They're absolutely free. Like these are tools at women's disposal. They just need to know about them. So let's start with this perimenopause concept in general. The word is out there a lot. We hear it all the time, but a lot of women still don't know what the heck we're even talking about. What does this actually mean? So can you define for us perimenopause and the symptoms that go along with it?
Yeah. So perimenopause is as unique as we are as women. So each woman, as they're navigating the mid to late 30s, early 40s, may start experiencing a constellation of symptoms. And let me back up a little bit and say perimenopause is the 5 to 10 years preceding menopause. Average age of menopause in the United States is 51. There are plenty of women that are experiencing perimenopausal symptoms in their late 30s. We have a lot of undiagnosed polycystic ovarian syndrome. So these are people that are already a bit progesterone deficient. And so really harkens the beginning of perimenopause is this drop in progesterone. Progesterone is a key hormone produced in the ovaries. And this may show up, the week or two before your cycle where you may have more anxiety, more depression, may have trouble sleeping. And as you navigate, moving from early perimenopause into mid perimenopause, that's when I think the most symptoms really start to become apparent. And it could run the gamut from brain fog to itchy skin to breast tenderness to heavy menstrual cycles that I affectionately used to refer to as crime scene periods. It can run the gamut from digestive concerns. It could go from bloating to diarrhea to constipation, new food sensitivities that people haven't experienced before, joint pain, things that I'm sure you probably saw in clinical practice, but maybe didn't realize it was a reflection of these alterations in progesterone and estradiol. And then, I would say that the mood disorders, the things that women are oftentimes prescribed antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications for, that really are a reflection of these alterations, almost always related to progesterone. And then the changes in estrogen can impact key neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. And so it's this motley crew of symptoms that are exacerbated by our lifestyle choices. So the word pause is really important when I talk about perimenopause, menopause. It's a time to reflect on what no longer serves us as women. And that can run the gamut from lifestyle choices, food choices, personal relationships, occupational choices. It really is a time for us to think about what is working well for us in our lives and what is not.
Mm.
And so I think there's over 100 documented symptoms of perimenopause. So I always say that it's as individual as we are as women. And if we look at it that way, it helps us understand it's not just one symptom. It is a constellation of symptoms that I think in many instances are worsened by lifestyle choices. That has been my clinical experience, my personal experience. And so we have to start shifting and changing the way that we interact with our environment, our personal care products, our food, our loved ones, our employers, if we're employed, or entrepreneurial
Our
journey.
employees, if we are employers. Yes.
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
Uh-huh.
So I think that I wish I could say it's just these five symptoms and that's what every woman experiences. And it just isn't the case.
Mm.
I have some patients that experience more mood disorders and depression and anxiety and brain fog. And then I have others that their symptoms are really musculoskeletal, or it's weight loss resistance, which is everyone's big pain point, or it's crappy sleep, or they feel like they're less stress resilient. And so I wish I could say it's, these five symptoms and that's what every woman's experience is, but it really is very unique.
One of the things I think is really challenging for a lot of women who like to ask why, like, why is this happening? Like, what's going on? I think like menopause, like as a single point in time, ovaries stop producing hormone,
Mhm.
like that is much more easy to understand
Mhm.
for a lot of people than is this like 10 longer period of time where like things are just wild and wonky and like
Mhm.
the ovaries are doing weird things. Um, why does that happen? Like, why does it, like, what's happening at the cellular level?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a couple of things. I mean, number one, I always help women understand it's like reverse puberty. Like as your kids are going through puberty, you are going through the end of your fertility period in your life. And so it starts from a kind of broad perspective. Like let's start from hormones. Like estradiol can be 20 to 30% higher throughout the perimenopausal transition. And it's this relative imbalance of progesterone to estrogen that in many instances is driving these symptoms that women experience, plus or minus alterations in cortisol and insulin sensitivity and other hormones, changes in melatonin, changes in leptin and ghrelin, which are these hunger and satiety hormones. But after the age of 40, we start having more mitochondrial dysfunction. So at a cellular level, we are experiencing mitochondrial decline. This can be exacerbated again by lifestyle choices. Like if you're not metabolically healthy, you're not insulin sensitive, you're going to have more mitochondrial dysfunction than perhaps someone who eats a nutrient dense whole diet and gets enough sleep and manages their stress as best they can. And so this is again where this lifestyle piece comes together with symptomatology. And I would be the first person to say, when I look at women, and I've taken care of tens of thousands of women over the past 9 years in this environment, and then certainly 100,000 plus women in my previous life, the people that are taking care of themselves, and I don't mean by like you're doing Pilates and you're drinking alkaline water and you don't have to work. That's not what I'm talking about. The people that invest the time in taking care of themselves from a spiritual, um, physiological, and psychological level are going to be much better off navigating this transition, because there is a little bit of a brain hiccup as you're navigating. It's, first of all, it's a realization like, I am getting older, number one. Number two, there's a lot going on throughout my body. There is not a cell in the body that doesn't have a progesterone, estrogen, or testosterone receptor on it, or for that matter, thyroid. And so you just start to understand that it's not just bikini medicine. It really is this systemic change and alteration in our physiology that, if we don't fight it and we start making changes, it makes the process a whole lot easier. I would say more often than not, my very type A, they run 10 miles a day. They get up at 4 o'clock in the morning. They've got these super demanding jobs. They've got a bunch of kids at home. I mean, there are the sandwich generation. Those women, they struggle to let go of control. And so in many instances, they are the ones that will have the bumpiest ride through perimenopause. And so this whole concept of release, like when I think about when I finally got to a point where I let go of control, things got a whole lot easier. So I try to embed that into my patients and clients as well, that I'm not saying that you have to accept, the unacceptable. What I am saying is that as we are navigating these profound physiological changes, the more we can understand, great. But the more we can let go of control and we just understand that we have to recalibrate. It's a recalibration. It really is. Physiologically, I think about Dr. Louanne Brisendine's book, The Upgrade. That's what she calls menopause. It's an upgrade. It really, that's the way to think about it and find a reframe, as opposed to being fixated on, I'm no longer fertile, which I think most of us, by the time we get to the other side, we're like, thank God I have no more cycles. This is so much easier. Perimenopause can be a bit of a wild ride, but I think once we figure out for ourselves and our patients the things that they need to change, it makes it a whole lot easier. Not just from a symptomatology perspective, but people start sleeping better. They have better interpersonal relationships. They generally will find that the way they view themselves has shifted quite a bit.
Something I want to add to that is, because I have a lot of very powerful, active women who are business owners, entrepreneurs. Just like you, and you share a lot of your own experience in your book. And I would love to just add on to that to say that doesn't mean that you can't do those things, but it does mean you probably need to reconsider how some of these things work in your life. And I see this in my own household. I see this again in my patients, where it's like you can still do amazing things, and arguably, I think you're going to end up doing them better. But you can't just drive. You can't drive 120 miles an hour anymore every day, because you're going to become more symptomatic. It's going to be harder for you every day, and I see this over and over again. So it is this combination of sort of like trusting, surrendering, but also figuring out how you can still achieve your mission and achieve your goals. It's a really delicate balance for sure. Let's shift to the gut. So your book is called The Menopause Gut. The microbiome is such an interesting space. And as you said, really, this is 5 to 10 years of, clinical research and bench research, and how we use this in clinical practice is all over the map. But there are so many things that we can now say that we are pretty sure are happening in the gut. And you do such a great job in this book of laying out a lot of these things. But let's just lay the groundwork here and say, for people that don't know anything about the microbiome, what is this thing called the microbiome? We'll get into how it affects women specifically in midlife, but let's just start with, what the heck are we talking about?
Yeah, we are more microorganisms than we are human. And so it's trillions of bacteria, protozoa, viruses, fungi that are part of what make us who we are. And it's not just the gut, it's the oral microbiome, it's the vaginal microbiome, it's the lung microbiome, it's the bone microbiome. Like literally every body system has its own microbiome, the skin microbiome. But when we're talking specifically about what is changing for women as we are navigating this perimenopause to menopause transition, it's the understanding that in the gut, literally every single body system, it determines when we go into menopause. It determines whether or not we have a healthy immune system or a healthy bones, or has the trauma we experienced as young adults and children, does that impact the microbiome? Yes, it does. And so I make the argument that the microbiome is really the key to longevity, and that the more we can understand about why it's important, what we need to do to support it, what are the things that are impacting it negatively, hint, hint, a lot of our modern day lifestyle in many ways, but the message is not that we can't fix it. We absolutely can. It's very malleable, but helping people understand the gut microbiome is part of our digestive system. It is, when I say the word malleable, it means, the choices that we make day to day do have a large impact. But what I found really interesting, Doug, when I was doing research for the book, was understanding all these connections, these axes between different body systems. When I really understood ovarian aging or immunosenescence, when I started to understand these very big concepts, I was like, wow, this is really fascinating that the ovaries are communicating with the gut, and the ovaries are what set the pacemaker of aging for us as women. And if there are things we know are accelerate or decelerate aging, it's like, why aren't we talking more about this? Because I find this uniquely fascinating. And maybe listeners don't know, but we are born as women. We are born with a finite amount of eggs. Whatever we have is what we're born with. And slowly over time, from puberty to up until menopause, we hopefully release an egg every month. It plus or minus gets fertilized or doesn't, or plus or minus gets reovulate or not. And a lot of women don't. Over the course of a lifetime, we start with a couple million. We probably have 300 to 400 at the time of menopause. So we still have eggs, but we're no longer ovulating, obviously no longer able to get pregnant without significant technology. So as I was writing this book, a lot of things came to me about like testing, like why am I seeing consistent results on women of a certain age group? Why am I seeing more inflammation? Why am I seeing alterations in keystone bacteria? Why am I seeing blunted short chain fatty acid production? Why are short chain fatty acids important? How does the impact of someone's trauma or high ACE scores influence when they go into menopause? And so I very humbly sit back and I just, being the nerd that I am, I was like, I'm seeing all these connections. I think this is really important. And I don't see anyone else really putting all these things together. So the book is really a nice way of kind of walking through the physiology of the body as we're aging, and then also providing a lot of solutions. So I think that's the most important thing to stress is on the other side are lifestyle strategies, supplements, medications, things that we can do,
Yeah.
diagnostic testing.
I'm going to get into solutions for sure. Before we do, a couple of the things you mentioned, some really important things in here. The immune system, for one. So a lot of people don't understand. I mean, most people don't understand where the immune system is. Like what is it, right? Like there's no immune organ really. So like, what is the immune system? But you could actually argue, I think that the gut actually probably is, if there is an immune organ, like it probably is the gut. So how is the immune system related to the gut? Why it is that then the gut kind of uses the immune system to communicate over the body? So what's this interaction like?
Yeah. So about 70 to 80% of our immune system is contained in the microbiome. So when I talk about it being so critically important, what I think many people don't know is that these very important hormones, estradiol in particular, that's where the bulk of the research is really the best communicator with the immune system. So there's all this interface. When we're looking at the small intestinal lining, literally it's the small intestinal lining, which is one cell layer thick, and on the other side of that is the immune system. So if you breach the small intestinal lining, which we refer to as leaky gut or small intestinal hyperpermeability, immune system's right on the other side, so it can get provoked very easily. The other thing that I think is so interesting is we have two different kind of major thoughts about the immune system. There is a less sophisticated, I don't want to say not important, less sophisticated, not as targeted immune system, and that's kind of the frontline soldiers of the immune system. And then we have another layer of the immune system that is more sophisticated, has a lot of special machinery that's designed to create memory cells and to get very specific when we're fighting off a virus. And understanding that as we are navigating this transitional period in our lives, as estrogen is fluctuating, it can trigger more inflammation. It can trigger inappropriate overactivation of the immune system. It can flip-flop things. Women are 4 to 5 times more likely to develop autoimmune conditions in menopause. And frankly, most of us have already developed at least one or two beforehand. And once you have one, we're more likely to have others. So this kind of potent hormone, estradiol, is the glue for the immune system, and it's the glue for the gut microbiome. It's the glue for so many things in the body. And so I always kind of use the analogy of, we have the frontline soldiers that go out, there it's not as specific, but it is a target attack. Even thinking about your skin, your mucous membranes, tears are all examples of this kind of very basic immune system. And then we have the other immune system that is, very potent, very powerful, but is designed to be very targeted. Those are the antibodies. And we use that terminology, thinking about it that way: T cells, B cells, memory cells. That is a much more sophisticated aspect. But what's amazing about this transitional period is we go from having a much more robust immune system to having a much less robust immune system. We get less vaccine responsive. And I don't say that to be political, that's just based on the research. We are more likely to have more inflammation, as I mentioned, the autoimmune piece. And so this explains why the pandemic is a good example. We really looked at the data on who were the people that were most likely to have untoward effects from getting the virus, vaccinated or not. On paper, it is people that are in this menopausal transition or older that are more likely to be unable to mount an immune response. There's something called the thymus gland, which most of us have probably never heard of. It just becomes a kind of a flabby blob of tissue. But the thymus gland is what over time is helping to kind of produce these thymus helper cells. And we get this flip-flop effect that happens in menopause. All of a sudden, like I mentioned, we have this much more reactive, more pro-inflammatory mediators, more likely to just overall not be able to fight off infections quite as effectively. And we're more likely to develop opportunistic infections. And sometimes the gut is the first place we will see those things. Like women will say, I have a dysbiotic gut. What does that mean? Someone told me, I did stool testing, and I'm like, I have yet to meet a middle-aged woman who does not have some degree of dysbiosis. And the way to think about dysbiosis or dysbiotic organisms is it's like having weeds in the garden. You plant fruits and vegetables, that's what belongs. And what grows up in between, because it's opportunistic, are these dysbiotic organisms. It's really a sign of this alteration in the terrain of our microbiome. And there's lots of things that we can do. I never want it to be the message that, immunosenescence happens and we just accept it. And, grandma gets sick so easily and is super frail. No. There's a lot that we can do to help offset these changes in the immune system, as well as the domino effect of everywhere else in the body.
Can you speak to the relationship between the hormone fluctuations and what's happening with the microbiome? Because this ties the perimenopause and menopause together with changes in the microbiome, because it is all these other things we're going to talk about too, but there's some specific things that are happening from a hormonal perspective.
Yeah, I would say, the first thing that I think about in particular, we were talking earlier about these very type A, very achievement oriented women, helping them understand, like, as we have less circulating progesterone, we become less stress resilient. We are more likely to deal with alterations in cortisol. And cortisol is not a bad hormone, but cortisol in particular can wreak havoc on the gut. And by that, I mean, if we are dealing with an acute situation, our cortisol goes up appropriately and comes back down. If we're dealing with a chronic issue over time, chronic cortisol elevation can lead to an elevation in glucose, which leads to an elevation in insulin, which leads to more alterations in the microbiome. We're more likely to deal with that leaky gut. We're more likely to deal with inflammation, that triggered immune response, which can impact our ability to fight infections, can deal with food sensitivities, can also deal with the loss of insulin sensitivity. So suddenly you're dealing with women who they're like, why is my blood sugar a problem? And, that is multifactorial. That is not just this one thing. It's also understanding that, this estrogen piece is so important. There's something called the estrobolome. I'm not sure whoever named it that, but it is such a goofy name, but it's really talking about where in the microbiome our body is helping to break down and package up and get rid of estrogen. And so you can be estrogen dominant, as they like to use that term, and still have alterations in endogenous estrogen. So the estrogen our body makes, and estradiol is the predominant form our body makes prior to menopause. If you're in a body is not able to properly break it down, and estrogen detoxification really is in the liver. There's two phases, and then in the gut. If your gut's unhealthy, Or if you have SNPs, genetic susceptibility, maybe you have detoxification issues. I'm thinking specifically about phase 2. If you can't package up that estrogen and get it out of the body, that can be problematic. A lot of women, phase 1, phase 2 work fine. They get to phase 1 and phase 2 in the liver are okay. Then it gets to the gut. And if they can't break down the estrogen, you can recirculate it. So it can magnify a lot of these estrogen dominant symptoms that women will experience. There's a key enzyme called beta glucuronidase, which is designed to kind of come through and clip the estrogen so you can package it up. Sometimes that is problematic. I think that, when I'm thinking about systematically how hormones are interacting with the gut, I think a lot about insulin and cortisol and glucose. I think a great deal about estrogen. I think about how progesterone modulates motility in the gut. A lot of women will tell me that because it's a smooth muscle relaxant, all of a sudden they just feel like they're not digesting their food quite as well. They feel like, they're having delayed gastric emptying without having things like gastroparesis, which you and I both know is super bad news. And the other piece is, I would say that testosterone in the research, really looking at how testosterone is oftentimes kind of coupled with things like PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. But not every woman that I see that has PCOS has high androgens in the body. But if we look at the microbiome research, women that have high androgens have alterations in the microbiome as well. So they're not processing the testosterone as effectively as they would in a non-PCOS microbiome, which we know at the basis of that is inflammation and insulin resistance as well. But those are some of the kind of key things that I think about in terms of hormones. Obviously, the health of our liver is critically important for breaking down and assimilating hormones. And this is not just you take a bottle of detox supplement over the counter and that fixes things. It really is lifestyle mediated, because that toxin bucket, we're exposed to toxins throughout our lifetime. Even if you live in a bubble, maybe not in a bubble, but you live a pretty healthy, pristine lifestyle. It's helping people understand that it's cumulative exposure over time, whether it's the fluoride in your toothpaste, the aluminum in your deodorant, it's the ultra processed food you're consuming. Is over time. I oftentimes will find women at middle age suddenly start having greater issues with proper detoxification. And could we make the argument that yes, we breathe, we poop, we pee, we sweat. Yes, that's how your body detoxifies. But a lot of women in middle age need a bit more support to be able to effectively have things like a bowel movement. Like, it's not normal to be constipated.
Right.
I think people are shocked to hear that.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah. And I mean, from a detox perspective, I want to get to that if we have time in the end, because it's so much of it is limiting what you're exposed to. Like you can only detox so much and you can't spend all day in a sauna. So yeah, it's a big issue. All right. So here's what I want to do. If we were to talk about each of these kind of like lifestyle pillars, we would spend like an hour on each one.
Yep.
So here's what I want to do. In the time that we have, I want you to spend like 2 to 3 minutes on each of these big sections, and I'll guide you through it and hit us on your biggest 3 points that you want to pass along to women on these sections. So we're going to start with what I think is without a doubt the most important thing, because if you don't have the right nutrition, the right food going into your body, kind of none of it other matters, except for maybe sleep, maybe just as important. But let's start with food. So top 3 things for women in midlife. Go.
Number 1, adequate protein intake. This is so important for satiety, but also because we need more protein with age, not less, to help offset sarcopenia and hit that leucine threshold that is so critically important for muscle protein synthesis. Number 2, it is fiber. It is the new F word. A lot of people think fiber is optional. It is critically important, especially as we are navigating this transitional period and short chain fatty acid production becomes so important, feeding those colonocytes. I would say number 3 is probably hydration. I cannot believe how many women I talk to are clinically dehydrated, and we lose, it's fascinating with the loss of estrogen, we lose those thirst receptors. They start to get a little bit dysregulated in perimenopause and in menopause. And so by the time people get thirsty, they're really clinically dehydrated. I would say hydration is so important for cognition, for weight management, for mental clarity. And it is so oftentimes minimized and depersonalized.
Well, that was, I think, under a minute. So I have a follow-up question then. So you used to and still do talk a lot about fasting.
Hmm.
has been a big part of your podcast and platform in the past. I think some of your thoughts have changed over fasting, especially for women in midlife. So give us the fasting update for women in midlife.
Yeah, I still think it's a good strategy. And I want to be really clear about that. But like any hormetic stressor, and that is what fasting is, just like infrared sauna, exercise, etc., high intensity interval training, it's helping women understand that protein intake needs to be the guide for whether or not fasting is appropriate. So if you are getting a minimum of 100 grams of protein into your feeding window, great. You can continue fasting. I'm typically fine with that. But what I find is most women, by the time they get to be 45, 50, don't realize that they're really not eating a lot of food every day. They might be
Mhm.
getting 800 calories a day, and then they're compressing their feeding window into 5 or 6 hours, or worse yet, they're doing OMAD, which is one meal a day. So I always go from a place of non-judgment when I say, can you get 100 grams of protein into your diet? If the answer is yes, great. That's like green, maybe caution light. The next question is, if you can't, then you need to widen your feeding window. And so this is why I've become a fan of something I've termed digestive rest, which is much more in alignment with circadian biology. And it's really eating when it's light outside and not eating within 3 hours before bedtime, and being very conscientious about 2 to 3 larger portions of boluses, if you will, of protein during the course of your day. And I find for a lot of women, if they slowly get themselves from this very tight, narrow feeding window and then they widen it, they feel better, their body composition changes, it's less stress on their body. I think that many people don't realize when you get up in the morning, so maybe you ate dinner at 6 and you get up and it's 7. So you've already been fasted for 13 hours, and then you go to the gym and you push yourself really hard at the gym. When you wake up in the morning, you're catabolic. We're already at risk for sarcopenia, this muscle loss with aging. Why would we want to put ourselves in a position where we're just breaking down more muscle?
Yep.
And so I very much and fervently believe in the concept of know better, do better. And so I always say, if you're not metabolically healthy, you've got 40, 50 pounds to lose, I think fasting is a great strategy, provided that you are conscientious of where you are in your cycle, if you're still menstruating, and your exercise patterns. I think that's always kind of are you premenopausal and still getting a cycle? Then we need to think about it differently. If you're in menopause, you can probably get away with a bit more fasting, but not at the
Mm.
expense of muscle. I think that is a very, very important running theme in my work, helping women understand that 12 to 13 hours everyone can do. Not everyone should be fasting 18, 20, 24 hours a day. And if that was ever the message that I shared, I want to apologize and say that, we have evolved, and I'm much more muscle focused now. So to maintain, because I'm a pretty lean person. And so I have to work a little bit harder to put muscle mass on my body at this stage of life, as
Yeah.
do most of my patients.
Yeah, and I just love to follow that with, I still love it because I've backed away from fasting quite a bit in my
Hmm.
recommendations, but I do still love it for metabolic dysfunction for
Yep.
people that have insulin resistance,
Hmm.
elevated fasting insulin, prediabetes, diabetes. It's an incredible tool.
Yeah. And I think it also helps people kind of reset their expectations. When we get to a point where we're no longer metabolically healthy and our body can't effectively utilize either stored fat or stored glucose or glycogen as a fuel source, I think it is very, very important for long term health, for longevity, to understand that we want our bodies to be able to use different types of fuel
Yeah.
substrates. We don't want them to just be skimming off the surface like most of us are that are eating a standard American diet and are eating 8 to 10 times a day. And for all those patients I told years ago, eat snacks and mini meals, I'm so sorry. Now I know better. And now I try to do better. But I agree with you that there are so many of us that are saying, we're not saying it's a bad strategy. We're just saying like a little bit of a caution light, make sure you're fueling your body properly, because that's a bigger message.
Yeah, and I have to talk about this relatively aggressively with my patients because a lot of my patients have osteoporosis. They're already
Hmm.
sarcopenic, and they come in and they're thinking longevity, and they're like, "Well, no, I'm doing OMAD. I'm eating one meal a day." And I'm like, "We got to rethink this because like you're going to have a hip fracture. Like this is what's
Hmm.
going to kill you. It's not your it's not your cell senescence that we need to worry about." So let's move on to sleep because sleep,
Okay.
arguably, probably second most important or most important. Top three things for sleep.
I think that I call it sleeporexia. I think there are people out there that are the sleep shamers, like, you need to be sleeping 8 or 9 hours a night. And if you're not, that's bad. I think we have to be thinking about sleep over time. Like, if you have 2 nights out of the week where your sleep isn't stellar, I'm less worried about that if the other 5 nights out of the week you're stressing high quality sleep, good sleep hygiene, cold, dark room, get off your electronics, do something relaxing before bed. Do not sit in front of a political figurehead on your TV and think that that's going to be good for your mental health going to bed. Like read a real book. Like turn on the red light in your room. Like we now have a infrared sauna light in our room, and I turn it on at night, and that's what we go to bed to before I turn it off, just to kind of like remind my body it's time to get ready to go to sleep. That's number one. I would say number two, I think it's important to move our bodies. I think for a lot of people, they don't make the connection that exercise supports really good quality sleep. I'm not talking about hurting yourself. I'm talking about just general physical movement, lifting weights, flexibility work. All those things are very important for sleep. And I said the other thing is I have to talk about hormone replacement therapy. I can tell when a patient is on HRT because their sleep is better. It may not be perfect, but it is always better. So progesterone generally helps with falling asleep, but you can get sustained release. Estradiol, very important for overall sleep support, as well as melatonin. I think melatonin has been painted as if you take melatonin exogenously, it'll suppress endogenous melatonin. Well, we start making less melatonin at 40. It makes sense to me because it's not just a sleep hormone, it's also a master antioxidant. So those would be the three things that I think are probably most important to talk to patients about because they may not be making the connection. And I think a lot of people, again, I go back to the sleep orexia, like people are very sleep shaming. Like you don't necessarily need a gadget to help you sleep. You don't necessarily need like these extraneous measures, but what you do need is good sleep hygiene, moving your body daily, and then the consideration of hormone replacement therapy. I've met women who are 10 years into menopause that have not slept well for 12 years.
Yeah.
And I'm like, how do you function? Like my brain would not function well if I was a habitual non-sleeper.
All right, exercise. So top things on exercise. We've kind of talked about it already, but let's get into like how's this different? So many women so into cardio and only cardio. High level athletes, I think, really struggle as they start to go through midlife, as women and men. So what are your top three things from an exercise perspective or movement perspective for women?
Number one, if we're talking about this vis-a-vis the gut microbiome, we understand that we get a transient leaky gut with intense exercise. So I'm not suggesting that you don't push your body, but just be cognizant of the training and recovery piece. Number one, you got to lift weights. If you're just starting out, body weight is fine, but you have to be pushing and maintaining muscle mass throughout your lifetime. We know that based on the research, it has potent anti-inflammatory effects. It's very important for the microbiome, obviously important for skeletal muscle mass, which is also important for insulin sensitivity. I would say number two, the right types of exercise. I know that sounds trite, but my generation was conditioned to believing that thin is in, lots of cardio. I'm not suggesting that you be sedentary, but zone 2 training is great. It's good for mitochondrial efficiency, biogenesis. It's good for recovery. Just making sure you're physically active. Like I actually have an Apple Watch. I do that to kind of remind me of how much movement have I had throughout the day. Because even though I am very conscientious about this, if I have a day where I have 9,000 steps versus 20,000 steps, that's a big difference in terms of net improvement. I would say the other thing about exercise that I think is really important is just overall flexibility. When we worked in cardiology, we would try to explain to patients that your flexibility in your joints, whether it's, your big muscle and joint groups or smaller ones, is conveyed into elasticity of blood vessels. And so I think for a lot of people, they don't think about flexibility from a movement perspective, but our bodies are designed to move in time and space. And so when we stop moving, not only does that eventually lead to sarcopenia, leads to frailty leads to falls, plus or minus loss of independence. And I think for a lot of individuals, they're not thinking 10 years, 20 years down the road. But right now, your 40s and 50s, you're setting yourself up positively or negatively for what your 70s and 80s are going to be like. And so I just think that locomotion piece, the strength training piece, movement piece, flexibility is all really, really important. And I think you hear a lot of echo chambers about strength training, which is super important. But I would also make the argument that the recovery, the flexibility piece, it doesn't even have to be, you don't have to do it in a class. You can do it at your house. I've got all sorts of gadgets and things I like to use at home that help with that. But remaining flexible and not dealing with chronic joint pain, or how many women that you did you see in your clinical practice as an orthopedic surgeon that, adhesive encapsulitis, that was just their norm. Like, oh, just suddenly one day I couldn't lift my arm above my
Right.
head,
Yeah.
or, I've got a stiff hip, or I've got chronic knee pain, or I have chronic ankle pain. And people just go, oh, I'm 50 some odd years old. This is just the way things are. And I'm here to tell you that doesn't have to be the case.
Totally agree. And there is such a big hormone connection there. And I want to get there after we do the last of these pillars, which is stress. Now we could talk about this one forever. But from a stress perspective, what are you educating women on? We talked about it a little bit in the beginning, needing to change the way that we view our work, our world, the people in our lives. But what can we do? Top 3 things for stress.
Number one, learn how to say the word no and
Mm.
mean it without explanation. So boundaries are critically important. I'm a reformed people pleaser. So I tell everyone that this is something I'm constantly iterating on. But when I learned the value of like really strong boundaries and saying no to the things that don't serve me, like I jokingly say, if it's not a hell yes, it's a hell no. That's just how my world functions. I would say number two is finding a stress practice, stress reduction strategies. Notice I'm saying plural,
Hmm.
how important they are. And it's not 5 minutes of meditation once a week. It's what can you do consistently that you like that alleviates stress in your life. And, for me, I have some very, very important things I do every single day. I have some type of a meditation practice. I exercise. Doesn't necessarily have to be like a really intense exercise. It could be, this morning I walked 3 miles because I've had a heck of a week. And so I was like, I don't need to add more stress to my body. I think the other thing that I would say is getting really proactive about, finding a strategy. Like before I step on stage, I have a ritual that I go through that no one, if they were to see me, would ever even know. I have breathing exercises that I do that help evoke the vagus nerve that will, bring my sympathetic nervous system, will kind of dial it back. But it could be that you take a couple deep breaths before you eat a meal. It could be that you box breathe. It could be that you are doing tapping. Anything that's going to evoke the vagus nerve. I notice all these things. I'm not talking about gadgets, although there's lots of fun gadgets that can help stimulate the vagus nerve as well. And I think those are helpful if they fit into your budget, but they're not a must do. But I would say those are the things I think are most important. And I could also layer in strategic supplements for when you're dealing with acutely stressful circumstances, like I've been doing over the past week, in particular. So I think for each one of us, it's finding what resonates. It's finding those boundaries and really standing up for yourself, because estrogen is a bonding hormone along with oxytocin. But I think for a lot of women, the people pleasing starts early. We start in our preteen, teen years, young adult years. We want to be liked. And so, that can persist and continue. And you may find that as you navigate the perimenopause to menopause transition, as estrogen is being depleted, we start finding our voices. And so that's a powerful shift for so many of us. It's something
Hmm.
that I think more women need to be made aware of, that's coming if they're not aware of it. And also, I mean, for me, I kind of retrospectively look back on my life and I think to myself, oh my gosh, why was I so good as an NP in that very male centric cardiology experience? Because I was a massive people pleaser,
Yeah.
massive.
Yeah. I love how you ended there by educating women that this is coming,
Yeah.
right? This change in your tolerance level. And I hear a lot of other influencers, women in midlife, kind of saying the same thing.
Mhm.
And I think it's really important to understand and to know that it's okay, right? Like it's okay for your boundaries to shift, and you just need to have open communication with those in your, personal life and professional life, and just be clear what they are. Uh,
Absolutely.
yeah. So that's a really big one. Okay, so we made it on the other side of lifestyle. So let's talk about hormones, because I treat women in postmenopause timeframe, perimenopause. I'm now educating a lot of providers from a perimenopause perspective because providers are desperate to find information, right? Desperate, probably as desperate as patients might be to find answers, because we don't have guidelines for perimenopause, right? There are very few books. There are very few research papers, actually. Like there are very few publications to really give us a guide as we go. So talk to me about your clinical experience with treating women. Let's like stop short of postmenopause, just perimenopause. How are you working with women, maybe testing and replacement if it's indicated? Like what are you doing in perimenopause from a hormone perspective?
Yeah, I mean, at the very, very beginning, it's like a very thorough assessment, like any good clinician would do. Do we need to start with a hormone, or is this someone where we really have to be targeted about lifestyle? So it is walking them through sleep is foundational. So that's number one, managing stress, the nutrition piece, plus or minus digestive rest or intermittent fasting, exercise. But it also looks at gut health. So we're doing diagnostic testing, we're looking at stool testing, plus or minus food sensitivity testing, the NutriEval. So it's looking at micronutrient deficiencies. That's a starting point for me. Also dealing with trauma. I think for a lot of individuals, they don't realize that so if we look up the adverse childhood events scoring, and this was a joint venture between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, and this is a test you can find online. It's free. The higher your score, the more likely you are to experience not only autoimmune conditions, but also very likely you're dealing with some metabolic health issues. Plus or minus, the research definitely demonstrates that you may go through menopause earlier because you've had a high degree of sympathetic dominance, high cortisol activation throughout your lifetime. You probably have also had a couple autoimmune disorders, not realizing that complex in a relationship, like we've talked about with leaky gut and dysbiosis and autoimmunity, and how that really gets magnified in middle age. So when I am thinking about women, it's starting with the basics, it's moving on to diagnostic testing. I used to use the Dutch quite a bit, and I do use it occasionally, but I don't depend on the results from that. I like quite a bit of serum lab testing to kind of get a sense of where we are. And to be clear, a woman in perimenopause, your estradiol levels could be 20 to 30% higher, especially in a loop cycle, than it is at any time in your life. So you think about the symptoms women experience, you can understand why they feel different. Depending on where you are in your cycle, testing estradiol on day 3, looking at progesterone, day 19 or 20 is very different. If you tested a time outside those parameters for a woman in even in pre-perimenopause, you're going to get skewed data. But it's also kind of looking at adrenal health, what's going on with cortisol. Are we dealing with someone that's really depleted? And you can see from saliva cortisol levels, like this is someone who doesn't have a healthy circadian kind of ebb and flow of cortisol over a 24-hour distribution. And then it's really looking at it sounds woo-woo, but really getting granular about like, what are they struggling with? Because they'll come in with weight loss resistance. That's
Mhm.
almost always the issue, the pain point. But it's, they're not in a happy marriage. And maybe they're not in a happy marriage because their hormones are depleted and they're not making healthy neurotransmitters, so they're anxious or depressed, or they're just not with the right partner, or they're really not happy in their occupation, or it could be a multiplicity of things. So it's really examining, it's almost like peeling an onion to get to, how can we help support this woman as proactively as possible, and do so in a way that's very customized and personalized. Like there is no one size fits all in my mindset, although there are some key themes. And clearly there are some people who come to me that sleep 4 hours a night. And that's like the lowest laying fruit. Like you have to deal with that first. Or you've got women that are, like we've talked about, super type A. Everything they do is intense. And it's saying like, can we get you to sleep 30 minutes more? Could we have you back off in the intensity? Do we need to be doing Orange Theory fitness 5 days a week with no recovery days? Do we need to be doing CrossFit 6 days a week with no recovery days? Do you realize the fact that your hair is falling out and your adrenals are thrashed and your weight loss resistant is a byproduct of your body being under too much stress? So there is definitely this psychological component that is a part of every conversation, and doing so from a place where there's a lack of judgment. Because I get it. I was there, 9 years ago, I was burned out and, weight loss resistant and never experienced that before. It's very humbling. And so I totally, totally get it. But I think that's one of the reasons why I wrote The Menopause Gut, was to help women understand what's happening to their bodies. It's also a love letter to other clinicians, because this isn't an area that I think all of us are necessarily talking about. Like we may be seeing these same patterns, but we may not be realizing that, like, as an example, as nitric oxide levels drop in the body, which kind of connect with estradiol levels, not only are we going to deal with hypoarousal, dealing with not having good orgasms, but we're also losing elasticity in our blood vessels. And what's the number one killer of women? Cardiovascular disease.
Still heart disease. Yeah, that's right.
Yep. And so I think it's multi-layered, but very personalized, very customized. But the pillars, as you talk about them, are similar for most of us. If we're really doing the on the ground work with patients, it's understanding that those are very important. They're foundational to all the other work that we do, because you can't fix someone. I always say this lovingly: you can't fix someone if you just slap an estrogen patch on them and you don't work on the sleep, the stress management, the nutrition, the exercise piece. In fact, more often than not, those patients really start to slip sideways and they don't feel good. And
Right.
so it's not to suggest a hormone-centric approach is not appropriate, but it's all about timing and figuring out where, if someone's already like stressed, sometimes adding an excitatory hormone like estradiol might make that worse. So maybe we add in some progesterone first, just kind of layering that in because it's more inhibitory, more relaxing, may help with sleep, take a little bit of the edge off for them.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I mean, in that answer, you didn't hit a hormone thing until the very end,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Well, because it stresses, I think a lot of people do the opposite.
sure.
And then you get someone who has, poor detoxification, whether plus or minus, if that's lifestyle mediated, genetically mediated. And so I always say low and slow wins.
Yeah.
Sometimes people want to go in and hit hard. They want to amp up the testosterone and estrogen at the same time as the progesterone. And if someone feels bad, you don't necessarily know what is causing the symptoms. So you're like, okay, what do I need to dial back on?
Yeah. And I've seen this happen in a couple of different ways, both good and bad. But from a bad perspective, I see women that will lean really hard on a hormone. Like for the testosterone is a great example.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned in your book, you're not a big fan of pellets, and I'm not either. I think they can be done well, but it's hard to know who does them well.
Yeah.
And when women go down this pathway of a high dose of testosterone, it will cover up a lot of sins for sure,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, she might feel amazing, but that's a candle that can really bite you too. And so, pulling really hard on one lever that maybe they might be deficient and they might need it, but you're pulling too hard. I see the same thing with thyroid, right? Overdosing thyroid for some women can make them feel really good.
Yep.
But then you are, like you're just revving your engine even harder. And that's going to come to an end probably in a bad way as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. There are people out there, I will not name names, who are not licensed clinicians that are making recommendations about hormones. And, I'm privy because of the podcast and because of a large free group I have on Facebook. People share a lot. And I always listen without judgment, but I also think about the fact that, you know, for every clinician that's out there that's trying really hard to give good information, to be clinically conservative, there's a cowboy or cowgirl out there spouting just really incorrect information. And so thyroid is one of many of the hormones that I will caution people about. Like, you're better off with a low and slow approach and titrating up. Like, maybe you're adjusting your thyroid dose every 2 to 3 weeks because you just need to go that slowly, and that's okay. But I also think that there's a lot of online resources, both good and bad. But I can speak from both personal and professional experience. There are definitely some cowboys and cowgirls out there where I just shake my head. I mean, I've seen myxedema coma, I've seen thyroid storm. They're not pretty. And for
Yeah.
listeners, these are the severe manifestations of thyroid disease, both of which can kill you. And so you have to be conservative. The thyroid is not to be messed with. And I think we're better off being conservative than being
Yeah.
cowboys and cowgirls.
Yeah. Unfortunately, on social media, the louder you are and the more extreme what you're saying is, the more views you're going to get.
Mhm.
And that's the algorithm. And that's really not helping, unfortunately, those of us that like, I might have a really boring conversation around estradiol and its appropriate use, and it's not going to go anywhere. So let's talk a little bit more about estradiol and progesterone specifically. when do you know how to layer these on for a
Mm.
woman who is still cycling, even if irregularly? Like, what are the things that you're looking for?
Symptoms. I mean, definitely symptoms. I mean, I think progesterone, except for those small subsect of people that are very sensitive to progesterone, um, progesterone is a lot of times life-saving. Like women will finally say, "Oh my God, my sleep quality. Oh my God, my anxiety is down 100-fold." So almost always starting with oral progesterone. And, there's oral micronized progesterone, which unless you have a peanut allergy, that would be a good starting point. It's inexpensive. Yes, you can compound progesterone and make it sustained release. That gets to be a little bit more expensive, but then you could make any dose you want, 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, 150, 250, whatever you want. But in the micronized piece that you can get at the pharmacy pretty inexpensively, that's 100, 200 milligrams. Estradiol, I think, is both very, very subtle because depending on where someone is in their perimenopause journey, she may not need estradiol until mid to late perimenopause. I see a lot of women that just get started on both early into perimenopause, and then they become way estrogen dominant and become much more symptomatic. Remember what I said, that 20 to 30% fluctuation in
More,
estradiol.
right? It's
Right.
higher, not
Yeah,
lower.
yeah.
Yeah.
So usually when they declare themselves, they're having brain fog, they're having, genitourinary symptoms. For me, the lever is definitely pushed hard when people are feeling like they're having neurocognitive symptoms, and we know that they're insulin sensitive. It's not an issue with blood sugar dysregulation or insulin resistance. But I have a pretty low threshold, but I start conservatively. Like it's that 0.025 patch. That's where we are starting. I'm not starting someone on 4 times that dose because
Yeah.
I know that I'd rather adjust as we go and then check and monitor levels. Now, it's very hard in perimenopause to check labs. It really is. Like you're not necessarily going to get a predictable, well, yes, no. If you test on day 3 and test on day 19 or 20 for progesterone, yes, you might get a better sense, but it can change cycle to cycle. I mean, there's very odd things that start happening. Women start having more anovulatory cycles. They may not have a 28, 30-day cycle, depending on where they are, if they're the tail end of perimenopause. So I think labs are helpful, but not important. We go off based on symptoms.
Yeah.
And then testosterone that's very bio-individual. A lot of women, their testosterone's low because they're super stressed. Like that is what contributes to why their testosterone. And there's a hormone hierarchy in the body. And whether people realize this or not, your body prioritizes insulin, cortisol to keep you alive over your sex hormones. And so I will sometimes say, if you're not chronically stressed, then you may not have issues with your testosterone. So the question is always, are they insulin resistant? Are they chronically stressed? Is it endocrine mimicking chemicals that are offsetting those receptors? And interestingly enough, I read a statistic the other day that those endocrine mimicking chemicals can offset the receptors and magnify those chemicals by like 100 times. So, there's a lot that can contribute to the ways that we feel navigating this transitional time in our lives. But those are the things that I'm usually thinking about. In addition to, do I see a lot of benefit from DHEA? Not really.
Mhm.
And I know that can be also very controversial. Pregnenolone, maybe maybe if we test it and we see that their pregnenolone levels are low, sometimes that can be helpful, but that's a good starting place, I think.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I mean, just the fact that you said that you actually use hormones, right? Because I mean, a lot of people, a lot of providers will say, not until you're post menopause. Like, no,
No, the
no.
research shows you do better. And,
Yeah.
had I known what I know, had I known 10 years ago what I know now, I definitely would have started sooner. My first TED talk was on perimenopause in 2018. And back then, that like no one was talking about perimenopause. So I always reflect on that we've come a long way in
Right.
not even 10 years.
Right.
So it's very exciting.
Yeah.
But yeah, the research definitely shows women do better if they're started earlier.
Yeah.
When I say earlier, prior to going into menopause
Right.
fully.
So, last question. This podcast is actually about the future of healthcare, and perimenopause is a big part of that. We do a lot of conversations there. But if you, Cynthia Thurlow, were given the keys to the healthcare kingdom and you could change whatever you want, what's one thing that you would change that would be for the betterment? And let's just make it specific to women. What's the one thing that you would change for women in the healthcare system?
We still have a very patriarchal system. No offense when I say that, but I think that women need to have different types of healthcare at an earlier age, not just you're sexually active, so you need a pelvic, and we need to do a PAP, and we need to do this. I think a greater awareness of younger women understanding the trajectory of their lifetime, understanding their options, understanding fully informed consent for every medication that they're taking, whether it's to prevent conception, whether it's to augment bleeding, whether it's to address pre pregnancy, pregnancy, postpartum. I just think that there needs to be greater awareness as a whole about women's bodies and healthcare. I feel like there's appropriately a lot of focus on younger women, whether it's contraception, pregnancy, postpartum, very appropriate. But there needs to be equal amounts of research dollars on middle-aged women, perimenopause and menopause, longevity, brain health, cardiovascular disease risks, more research dollars. Up until 1993, women were excluded largely from research because, oh, our periods were confounding variables. They didn't want to have to take into account where a woman was in her menstrual cycle. And so I hope in my lifetime that we will see more of that, because I think that although my generation is certainly loud and proud and we are changing the way that we look at healthcare for women, I want subsequent generations, I want my boys and my future daughter-in-laws and my nieces to all have the benefit of just being more bodily aware and health aware than I was. Like, I think about the fact, I actually went back to my original textbook in graduate school. What did we talk about in terms of menopause? It was like a paragraph.
Yeah.
I jokingly say a sentence, but it was that minimized. Like, you drop off a cliff and I'm like, oh, that's so many years away. I don't even want to think about it. And I think we're changing the narrative, but it's going to take time for sure.
Yeah. So education and research on midlife. I think that's awesome. Well, Cynthia, tell people how they can find your book and also other resources. I mean, you're doing a lot of things. So where can people find the things?
Yeah, I would say easiest place to start is my website. So www.cynthiathurlow.com. My new book is called The Menopause Gut. It is on pre-sale. We have lots of amazing pre-sale bonuses, things you actually will use, not junk you don't want, like a pantry guide. In addition to that, I'm active on social media, probably most active on Instagram, but I do have a presence on Substack, Twitter, which is now X, YouTube, and I do have an amazing, amazing podcast called Everyday Wellness. It is one of my favorite things I do in my business. And I get to interview the best and the brightest in the health and wellness space, like Dr. Doug,
Yes.
and share their amazing gifts with the community. But that's a good place to start.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time. Again, I know you got to go, but I love this conversation and I love the book. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you so much.